So receptors, let's see what we got. So there's different types of receptors, and this is what brings information into the nervous system, peripheral nervous system, right? Because the central nervous system is the spinal cord and then the brain and spinal cord. But the first place these sensory neurons go to is the spinal cord. But how does it get to the sensory neuron? With the sensory receptors, right? And that's pretty much what we're going to talk about. And we'll go on to the transmission pathways and how nerves will repair themselves, hopefully. and we'll talk about reflexes. And these three parts are in different PowerPoints. So again, I already narrated them, but let's do this recording and see what we could find out here. Now you know all this already. This is good review. Like this is something you'll see on this week's exam, or you'll see this on the departmental final. The different parts of this, the nervous system, central and peripheral. Right, so the peripheral has the sensory incoming, see the blue arrow coming in, and then your motor, which is efferent, make sure you know those terms, out of the CNS is efferent, or out towards the muscle is efferent, sensory is afferent, coming in, right? So somatic versus autonomic, and that I talk about a lot. You'll hear that on the recordings. And the effectors that they go to, like the somatic nervous system. This is motor. This is only motor up here. This is motor. The effector for the somatic nervous system, I can't say this enough, is skeletal muscle. The effectors for the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic, and you should know a lot about that now, even though we didn't do the whole chapter yet. The effectors here, I know I said this a lot, but it's worth repeating, are smooth muscle, also known as visceral muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, adrenal glands, sweat glands, endocrine glands. Okay, and you'll do endocrine in A&P 2. I think that's the first thing you do. Sensory receptors now, sensory, and there's somatic and visceral sensory, and there's special sensory. So we have to talk about somatic senses, which is that touch and pain and all that. And then you have special senses. There's 5 of those: your vision, your olfaction, your gustation, your audition, and your vestibular. Gustation means taste. Vestibular is balance. Olfaction is smell. So there's 5 of those. And then you have your visceral, comes from your organs. Visceral or viscera means your organs, right? Not your somatic. So there's a difference between somatic and visceral. Sensory receptors and their sensations. So receptors are the tissue, and it's nerve tissue, that responds to a change in an environment or some type of stimulus. So the stimulus is the change, the injury, like the nail, the hot, the cold, the light from your photoreceptors, rods and cones, your vibration in your ear, touch, taste through chemicals, olfaction through chemicals. So in order to get that cognition of that sensory input or stimulus, it has to get, first of all, it has to get to your postcentral gyrus, because that's your somatic sensory area. So you need an action potential. It comes in as graded potentials, right? And then if you reach a threshold and there's depolarization, you're going to get an action potential. And that's what we talked about on the last few slides, or the nerve tissue. We did that a couple of weeks ago. So I would say nerve impulse is just another name for action potential. And if you go back, you know I mentioned this a lot. In the nerve tissue, whatever that is, chapter 11, I think. because I think we're in 13 when we talk about PNS. So you have to be aware. You have to be aware of and be able to interpret what you feel. Not emotional, although that counts, but I'm talking about somatics and special senses, what you see, what you hear, what color is that? What does that feel like? Is it rough? Is it sharp? Is it smooth? All that is perception. And that's perceived in the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe. So you should know a lot about the post-central gyrus. And in lab, you have to know where it is, of course, and what the central sulcus is. So the post-central gyrus is parietal lobe, posterior to the central sulcus, and that's your somatic or somatosensory area, where you cognate and perceive what you feel through sensory afferent. So this is all about sensory, no motor here, all coming in afferent from the PNS into the CNS. Whew. So you can classify the receptors. This is kind of confusing, but I'll kind of memorize some of them too. So the type of stimulus, like pain, temperature, light, vibration, and then the body location, right? Cutaneous, and you remember we did the epidermis, and we did the integument, and the structure of them. Are they free nerve endings? Are they encapsulated, which enhances something like fine touch? Yeah. I like this. This is where I live. I love learning these because this kind of puts everything into what's going on. It's the general way to do it. So you have mechanical receptors or mechanoreceptors, and they respond to mechanical stimulus, like touch, or touch from your fingertips or other areas in your skin, pressure, vibration. Now, vibration could also mean is the way we sense hearing, and also vestibular balance is vibration into the ear. Remember the external and internal acoustic meatus and all that business? We have an internal or an inner ear and middle ear and an outer ear. And that's what you have to learn for lab, just the parts. But the receptors for hearing or vibration are mechanical. That's vibration is mechanical. Stretch, like in the muscle spindle of your muscles, or the tendon organs in your tendon, or your joint kinesthetic receptors in your joints, or about movement and stretch. So that's mechanical receptors. Yes. Thermoreceptors are straightforward. They could be just temperature, change in temperature from hot to cold, cold to hot. And that could be your somatic, or it could be in your blood vessels or your hypothalamus to tell you what your body temperature is. So you're going to also hear intero, probably on the next page, intero and extero receptors. So extero are more the somatic senses, like the hot from that you feel, but intero is in your blood vessels. Pretty easy to understand that. Photoreceptors are really easy because it's only in one place, and that's the retina, which you have to see in lab. You know, you'll see the different layers of the eye. You'll slice up. Jeremiah was slicing up the eyeball last Thursday, and you'll see the different parts. Everybody did a great job. So that's you tomorrow, Christina. So that responds to light, photons. Chemoreceptors, chemical receptors. So this is your olfaction, because odor, like from an onion or from a rose or a tulip, is a chemical that comes into your nasal cavity, and your cribriform plate has these little receptors under it, and the superior nasal meatus, and it's an odor is a chemical. Taste, gustation, is a chemical that touches the taste buds in your tongue. And we learned the cranial nerves. I'm going to go through them briefly later, and how the cranial nerves are sensory, special sensory, some of them. Like smell is cranial nerve 1. That's it, special sensory. Taste is a little more complicated. Most of taste comes in cranial nerve 7, the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, which is the facial nerve, and cranial nerve 9 is the posterior third of the tongue, and also the vagus nerve gets involved. So that's a little more complicated. And those are extero receptors. But the intero, about blood chemistry, How much hydrogen ion is there to check for acid? How much carbon dioxide is in there? Because you can't have a lot of carbon dioxide floating through your blood. You got to get that out through your respiratory system. So the chemoreceptors are for chemicals. So these are the hardest ones to understand, but these are chemicals. So this is a really good slide to learn the types of receptors based on their stimulus. I like this the best. And then you could break it down. Here's another one, a specialized receptor. Get this one, nocio. The noci means pain. Pain. Like all the tests you have are giving you pain, but it's a different kind of pain. This is not the same thing. This is pain that's caused by damaged tissue, right? Or inflammation within the body. So you have pain receptors within blood vessels. But get this, learn this right now. Listen to me. You remember the brain? Remember the brain thing, that spongy looking thing that's in your cranial cavity and the spinal cord too? There's no nociceptors or nociceptors on the brain. So there's no brain pain. It all comes from inflammation in the blood vessels. Yeah, so nociceptors are sensitive to the stimulus of tissue damage usually, or inflammation, or excess pressure. Like heat and cold, you should say, what you should be saying, now wait a minute, didn't you say there's thermoreceptors for these things? That's what you should be saying. But it's kind of a crossover. You get the same kind of receptors basically for heat and cold. They're both free nerve endings for heat, cold, and pain. They're free nerve endings, very sensitive. So sometimes you don't know if like you're in pain because you got burned. During the burn though, not after, of course. Nociceptors, pain. So here's the extero. So the stimulus is coming from outside the body. That makes sense, right? So examples are your touch receptors in your skin, like your Pacinian corpuscles, your Meissner's corpuscles, Ruffini, and all those specialized receptors. And also the pressure that you put on your body, or the pressure from touching something. And pain, of course, is extero. Temperature, extero, and entero, because you talk about temperature and the body temperature. But we're talking about temperature that you sense from your skin, say. And your special sense organs, like your retina, of course, and your taste buds and your inner ear, are exteroreceptors for the most part. You might have an argument with the inner ear, but that's okay. You'll see them in next semester. Interoreceptors, also visceral. Visceral is within the organs or the blood vessels. All right, so this is something in the blood vessels. Changes like temperature. See, temperature showed up again on interoreceptors. I knew that was going to happen. You could have stretch of blood vessel tissue, right, or tissue within your digestive system, which you'll learn next semester. But mostly chemical changes, that what you need to know now. And you'll do cardiovascular next semester, so you'll know about baroreceptors. I'm just going to write this down. Like a baroreceptor is sensitive to pressure. Baro means pressure. So that it pretty much checks your blood pressure within your vessels. And technically a baroreceptor is a stretch receptor, because the blood vessels stretch under high pressure. So that elicits a baroreceptor stimulus. Yeah. Also discomfort, like stomach pain, uterine pain, ovarian pain, if that happens. Digestive system, mostly. And it's kind of vague, right? You can't, especially gastrointestinal, it's kind of vague where that pain is coming from, although you perceive it, you cognate it. Because it's coming from the viscera. It's an interoreceptor. Or interoceptor. Sometimes they take the re off of there. It's the same thing. Though. Here's a good one. Now, technically, these are mechanical receptors. Or just say mechanoreceptors. Or receptors. These are mostly in your joints, like your muscle spindle and skeletal muscle, your tendon organ, in your tendons, or your joint kinesthetic receptors in your joints, in your synovial joints, right? And also you have some receptors in the ligaments. So receptors about kinesthesia, or kinesiology is the study of movement, especially joints, right? Kinesiology, kinesio, movement, kinetic movement. And your brain, not only your conscious brain, but your cerebellum, right, which is unconscious control of motor output, balance and equilibrium. And like if you're standing on a balance beam, or you're learning how to hit a golf ball or play the piano with foot pedals. Okay. Receptor structure. This is a little bit more difficult because you got to memorize more with these. So simple receptors could just be dendrites, right? Free nerve endings. Simple. General senses or somatic senses too, right? So they monitor general sensory information. But special senses, again, you're not going to learn any, like you're going to learn the ear and the eye, but AMP2, you'll learn how the receptors, the rods and cones, modulate your vision. Cones are more for color, light, and more visual acuity, where rods are dim light. Hearing, and you're going to see all that on the sheep eye, or the cow eye in the model and lab. That's what you have to know for the lab. Hearing and equilibrium are part of the ear. So they have specialized receptors for vibration. Remember, vision is photoreceptors. Exteroreceptors, hearing and equilibrium are mechanical receptors, mechanoreceptors for vibration. And the structures, like the cochlea is for hearing. You have to see that in lab. You just have to see it and know what it is, the cochlea. Equilibrium are these semicircular canal, and they're all part of this labyrinth. It looks like a snail in your inner ear. So you have to just see them for AMP1. AMP2, you learn about them, all the receptors, and know what the receptors are for lecture. Smell is olfaction. We don't even do that really, but you should know that it's olfaction. And I mention it once in a while. First of course, you have to know what cranial nerve 1 is, olfactory nerve and bulb on the sheep brain and on the human model and for lab. Taste is your taste buds. We don't really do that too much. Smell and taste, as I mentioned, are chemoreceptors, exteroreceptors. Yeah. And they're housed in the sense organs, like the cochlea for hearing, the semicircular canals for equilibrium, and for vision, it's the retina, which is a whole complex of things. Taste is your papilla, which have taste buds in it. Yeah. And smell is your olfactory bulbs, are the organ. Okay. How are we doing so far? Any questions for anything? You guys awake? Okay. Yeah, so chapter 15, that's one of the chapters you're doing in AP2. Okay, general senses again. And these are more, but different now. We have touch, pressure, stretch, vibration, temperature, muscle, all the same thing. Right? And no one receptor, one function relationship. So it crosses over a little bit. That's really not important. So what they're saying here is that receptors can respond to multiple stimuli, like that pain and temperature thing. So here's the takeaway here. You have non-encapsulated, which are free nerve endings, which are basically dendrites. Remember the incoming part of the neuron? Then you have the encapsulated, like the Pacinian corpuscle, like when you're corpuscle or Ruffini corpuscle, Meissner's corpuscle, they have encapsulation, usually like a connective tissue lamellated covering. Kind of like a myelin sheath, but it's not myelin. It's not myelin. It's connective tissue that has some lipid on the top sometimes, but it's encapsulated in sheaths. So hopefully you get a nice picture coming up soon. And we saw it when we did the integument, right? This is still AP1. So non-encapsulated, you see a lot of those in your epithelium of your skin. And there's different populations. Like when we're doing like the primary somatosensory area in the postcentral gyrus, you saw that you have a lot of receptors like in your fingertips or on your face, because that's very sensitive to touch, right? And remember the dermis is the dense irregular connective tissue that has a lot of non-encapsulated nerve endings as well. You pointed them out on the lab practical very well. Yeah, and they're called small diameter group C fibers, like something like that. They may ask you on the departmental final. Like I might have left some of those questions on the practice questions. I'm just giving you an example. This technically doesn't have to be there, but so again, the small diameter sensory fibers called group C fibers. And again, these are non-encapsulated. So the ones that are non-encapsulated are temperature, like I told you, pain, or very light touch. And these are the ones that are in the epidermis, more in the skin. Some more thermoreceptors. And here's the temperatures, right? Activated by temperatures 10 to 40 degrees Celsius, okay? I won't ask you that, but it might be on, again, that could, something like that could show up. And the superficial dermis, free nerve endings going to the epidermis. So cold, 10 to 40, and body temperature is like 37, so. And heat receptors, 32 to 48, deeper in the dermis. Sometimes sometimes the temperature is perceived as pain because they're both free nerve endings, non-encapsulated, and they're very close to each other in places like the skin. Okay, nociceptors, remember pain, think pain, nociceptors or nociceptors are pain. So either that's that high or above 40, right, degrees or below 10, not above 40, higher than that, but below 10 for cold. Pinch, right, it's kind of like a tissue damage that elicits a response or it elicits a stimuli to the receptor, and then release of chemicals from like cut tissue or broken tissue or blood vessel damage. So from tissue damage, it releases chemicals which stimulate the pain receptors, the nociceptors. Yeah. A vanilloid receptor is a nerve membrane is the main layer. All right, a valinnoid receptor. So that's the protein that's in the nerve ending. And it's a channel. And again, heat, acid, and other chemicals, right, will give you pain, right? Capsaicin is that chemical that makes like your buffalo wild wings hot, right? Because it's in red peppers. They use that for buffalo wings and all that. The more capsaicin, the hotter it is, right? I forget what that scale is called. I always forget. So that's a chemical, right? And it could burn, and it gets into your nose too, which makes that burn as well. I'll remember the scale later on. Itch, right? You've had that. Everybody's had that. Skin gets a little dry. You know, you get an itch, but also inside, the histamine is not released to your skin. It's released from your blood vessels into the tissue, usually in response to an allergic reaction. And you'll learn about the white blood cells that become tissue cells that release histamine, right? Because when you're stung by a bee or you're allergic to something, histamine is released, so you take an antihistamine to relieve the itch, like allergies this time of year. Schofield scale is the level of heat in those wings. Schofield, or Scoville, I'm not sure. Look it up, let me know. Okay, non-encapsulated still. So now we have the Merkel's discs for light touch, and the hair follicle receptors, which are free nerve endings as well. Also light touch. So they kind of amplify the light touch. Like, look at this makes sense, right? That you could feel that mosquito landing on your skin, a slight change in stimulus that causes an action potential, though you could perceive that. So the hair follicle receptors are about that really light touch. Merkel's discs are the light touch we use on our fingers, right? When we really want to close our eyes and feel something and see what we perceive as that light touch feeling. So here you go. Now finally, let's talk about the different types, and pictures are always helpful. right? And the free nerve endings here in tissue. And it breaks it down. I always like these tables to go through before you take an exam. And these are modified like a Merkel's disc, right? What they look like. And here's the neuron, sensory neuron, that the depolarization will continue into the spinal cord. But this is all peripheral, right? These receptors are peripheral nervous system, whether they're exteroreceptors or interoreceptors. And here's your hair follicle receptors. When you name those, actually, you call them nerve tissue, just because, again, you didn't learn the nervous system at that point. You do in chapter 5, which is just the integument. Then you have the encapsulated ones. So they're still dendrites in a way, but they're enhanced by an encapsulation. So it's not just free nerve endings. So this is the difference, the free nerve endings versus encapsulated. So free nerve endings and Merkel discs are non-encapsulated, but now we're talking about the encapsulated ones because they're encased in this connective tissue capsule. And one type is Meissner corpuscle. The other is the Pacinian corpuscle. So Meissner's are pretty interesting because they're for discriminating touch, discriminative. So that basically, you have 2-point discrimination. Like you could tell if I use like 2 little pins and I put them in the back of your hand as opposed to the fingertips, you could tell that there's 2 different stimuli there. So that's discriminative touch. And that's done through these Meissner encapsulated corpuscles. Pacinian corpuscles are for deeper, like these are close to the bottom of the dermis. And these are large receptors for pressure and vibration. So you really need to elicit a heavy vibration or pressure to elicit a stimulus to the Pacinian corpuscles. So if you remember from the skin, from the integument, that these are deep in the dermis. Ruffini, okay, these are, again, endings. They're bulbous because they have an encapsulation. Again, they're also encapsulated. And this is, again, deep pressure. So again, there'll be different encapsulated ones. The muscle spindles have encapsulation, and they're proprioreceptors for movement. These happen to be for stretch. So the muscle spindle is going to be the receptor for our knee jerk reflex. And because your quadricep is going to stretch, and then it's going to react by extending. And you'll see that. So it'll contract to extend, like a quadricep. That's what the action of the quadricep is, leg extension. Then a tendon organ is more about, actually it's more about tension than stretch, to tell you the truth. But it's also a proprioreceptor, mechanical, and these are mechanical receptors now. That was the first classification. And they're in the tendons. So technically they detect tension, not stretch. Joint kinesthetic receptors are about like change in direction, like when you're playing basketball and you accelerate and decelerate and cut to the left, cut to the right. So they monitor your joint position and send a signal to your CNS, of course, and ultimately the cerebellum when you're learning how to play basketball or learning how to bowl, play golf, or hit a baseball. Right, so they come into play. Or hurdling, all kinds of things. Gymnastics, you're using these receptors a lot. You're using the cerebellum a lot. So here's a good table. Shows you the Meissner's, Pacinian, encapsulated now, right? These are encapsulated. And the bulbous Ruffini's, this muscle spindle, which we have to get to know because we got to see that when we do the reflexes, stretch reflexes specifically. Then you have the tendon organs, and you can see that's a little difference in the tendon. And again, it says here now, it does say tension and stretch, but it's really about tension. And that's encapsulated too. And the joint kinesthetic receptors. sensory processing. Okay. So the sensation of you being aware of what you sense, whether it's a special sense, somatic sense, or visceral sense. And perception is how you interpret that. And this involves, the other parts of your brain that have to do with memory, right? Because that's the first thing. Is that familiar? Is that unfamiliar? So here's somatic sensory system. Somatic now. This is not visceral. And not special sense, really. I mean, of course, special senses are somatic. They're not visceral, but we're talking about the other ones. Okay, so this is mostly about your limbs and your body wall. I'm not sure what that means, body wall. But it receives input, the somatosensory system now, not just the receptor, from the extero, proprio, and intero. And it's relayed toward the brain, of course, that's where the brain is, in the head, and processed through the spinal cord and other parts of the brain before you get to the cerebral cortex. So pain is really a survival mechanism, and it's an emotion that we have to perceive to know there's some type of tissue damage or impending, I like this, impending tissue damage. So action can be taken to avoid the pain, right? So pressure and temperature, and this is stimuli for the pain receptors, which remember are free nerve endings. Excessive pressure, though. Excessive pressure beyond what we feel in those Pacinian and Meissners. Histamine, which is a chemical release. Ions, like potassium and ATP, of course, acids, and another chemical called bradykinin. Again, this is something like bradykinin, histamine you learn in AP2. Right? But these are just chemicals that can give you the perception of pain. Right? But here's the chemicals that are released. Now, glutamate is an amino acid that's released in the pain pathways, but this is really more important. So, and this is easy to remember. Remember, substance P is released from the neurons in the pain pathways. So ultimately, substance P is what gives you the perception of something being painful. That's why something like an endogenous opiate, which are made in your brain. I'm not talking about taking opioids, but the ones that are released and stored and manufactured in your brain. So like an endorphin, there's another one called encapsulation, similar. These two will, especially endorphins, will block substance P, so you don't feel pain. That's why these are painkillers, these endogenous opioids. All right, so encapsulation suppresses the substance P, but endorphins block it. So endorphins are more long-lasting and better for reducing pain. Encapsulins are short-acting, but they suppress the pain, lower the pain perception, so it lowers the substance P. There you go. Excuse me. Visceral pain comes from the organs, like your visceral organs. It has receptors for pain. Of course, these are interoreceptors now. But if it's especially the gastrointestinal, it's not pinpoint. It's kind of vague. And it aches, like colic pain. Colic pain kind of comes up and down, like a stomach ache. Gnawing, I'm not sure what that means, but I think it's kind of like a nasty twisting kind of pain. And burning is kind of subjective. You're saying burning. And probably because that's what it reminds you of when you feel that pain coming from your viscera. So, we have a lot of stretching, especially when there's a lot of gas in your digestive system or too much fluid in your bladder or constipation, things like that. Ischemia is low oxygen supply, which gives you pain. Of course, if this happens in your heart, you're going to have a pain called angina pectoris. Angina, you might have heard of that. Angina is pain in the chest and maybe the left arm, because you have decreased blood supply to the heart muscle. And that decreased blood supply is decreased oxygen. And that's called ischemia. So it's a lack of oxygen to the muscle cells of the heart. for example, but it could be other organs too. Chemicals is kind of general, right? The different chemicals, and you'll probably learn more of those in AP2, the pain-producing local hormones that are released and other chemicals. Pain in muscles, like from tightness, cramps, or spasms, right? Usually a muscle spasm is due to like overuse or fatigue, maybe a draft, right? It causes muscle spasms and injury below in the spinal column, or the joint pain, or joint sprain or strain that causes spasms. A cramp is usually due to more loss of electrolytes, problem with your fluid imbalance. I like talking about this too. Referred pain. The referred pain is like I mentioned before, like if you have ischemia in your heart, you can feel chest pain, but you may also feel pain down your left arm or up into your jaw. So the pain is coming from one place, like the heart, but it's causing perception of pain down your arm. The problem is not your arm, it's the heart. Like you might have heard of something like sciatica, right? Sciatica. Sorry. And you know that sciatic nerve is that big nerve that comes from the lumbar and sacral plexus of the spinal nerves. And it has motor and sensory. It's not a cranial nerve, of course. Motor and sensory nerve to a big part of the back of the leg, posterior buttocks down to the posterior hamstring, or into the calf to the foot. So the term sciatica just means pain along the distribution of the sciatic nerve. So pain down your butt, into your hamstring, into your calf, into your foot, even to the bottom of the foot. And it's just a symptom, really. But sciatica could have many causes. Like you could have a herniated disc in your lumbar spine that's pressing on a spinal nerve. So the problem is pain in the back of the leg, but the real cause is the herniated disc, intervertebral disc. Prostate cancer can give you sciatica, which is a big difference. Or you could just have a muscle spasm in like one of the glute muscles, like it's a deep muscle called the piriformis, which I didn't show you because it's not on your list. But it's a hip rotator that it's right above the sciatic nerve, and the spasm of that can cause pain down the back of the leg, like sciatica. All you gotta do is stretch out, right? When it's in spasm. If that glute muscle is in spasm, or the piriformis, or the gemellus, or the hip rotators, you can have a condition like sciatica, which is not a condition. I shouldn't say that. It's a symptom. Yeah. And visceral, which is what I was talking about before with the heart. Like you could have a gallbladder inflammation or gallstones, and you'll feel that up in your right shoulder. That's referred to that area. Kidney stone, you could feel that in your lower back or in your groin. So the stimulus is coming from one organ or one area, and it's causing pain to another. It has nothing to do with the cause. Like this, I was saying before, the ischemia or a myocardial infarction is really what a heart attack is. That's death of the muscle tissue in the heart. That's what a heart attack is, myocardial infarction. And same thing with angina. Angina pectoris is just pain from ischemia. It's not a myocardial infarction, though. That's just from ischemia. So that's really from pain down your arm and chest from ischemia. But a heart attack is myocardial infarction, which could start out as in ischemia, but it's death of the tissue. So that the cells of the heart are actually dying. Okay, so that's a myocardial infarction. That's different than ischemia, but ischemia can lead to death of the tissue, and a heart attack, which is the same thing as myocardial infarction. Heart attack is not the proper use when you're a nurse, you know. So these are just diagrams of where you could feel pain coming from different organs. I mean, this kind of makes sense. The appendix is not referred too far, right? The appendix is here anyway. Colon right in the middle. Ureters down here. Again, I like talking about the heart because it's more widespread, like up in the jaw or in the chest, of course, and down the left arm. That's the blue outline here. Lungs up in the above the left clavicle. All right. Anything else? Gallbladder. See the right shoulder, right? Because the gallbladder is like right around here, so it makes sense you'd feel pain there. But refer to the right shoulder. So somebody can come into your clinic and you're treating them for bursitis. Oh yeah, that's bursitis. You have pain in your arm, but it's really coming from their gallbladder. You're in trouble. Of course, it makes sense the ovarian pain is there, but kidneys is really widespread. Look at that; it's all over the place, going even down the side of the leg by the TFL and the ITB. So that's all about referred pain. It's a mapping. Of course, you don't have to memorize this, but remember the ones I said: the heart and the gallbladder, and appendix, of course, because it's in the right lower quadrant, which you told me on the first exam. And urinary, yeah. This is interesting. Like you could have a limb amputated, right, for whatever reason. Let's say diabetes, and of course that's painful before you have the amputation. And, you've had long-lasting, intense pain there for so long, like something like diabetes, or of course, to be dramatic, like if you're in a war and you have a massive infection or something, your leg or something is in a lot of pain. Hyperalgesia is high pain perception, high feeling of pain, so it's amplified. Not really about threshold, although that can be used for a low threshold for pain. But if you have chronic pain that's been there for years, and all of a sudden you lose that limb, you still feel the pain as if you had the limb after it's amputated. That's called phantom pain. So this happens a lot with diabetics when their toes are amputated, because again, when you have diabetes mellitus uncontrolled, the glucose is just destroying your blood vessels, so the tissue of your toes becomes necrotic. It dies, and you can't leave it like that because it's going to affect the rest of your leg, so you have to amputate it. So that pain that you had before remains, that chronic pain, even after the limb is amputated or the toe is amputated, whatever it is. Because you have these N-methyl diaspartate, NMDA receptors, and this is for glutamate. This is for glutamate mostly, which is, remember, is the most excitatory neurotransmitter in your body, and aspartate, of course. They both have the same receptor. So they're getting depolarizations, even though the limb is not there anymore. So your spinal cord learns about that incoming pain because it's so chronic and amplifies that pain, which doesn't sound like a good way to live either way. So early pain management, of course, is critical. And I don't know if there's any treatment for phantom pain. It's probably psychological treatment, because medications are just going to amplify it when they wear off. So yeah, phantom limb pain, that's a scary thing. So they use an epidural. They'll give you an epidural injection to numb out everything, so you don't feel any pain, but you don't feel the rest of your leg either. It's not just the one limb, both sides. Sometimes, depends where they put the epidural. Is it on the nerve root, or is it right in the middle? Yeah. So let's go through the nerves. And this is going to be helpful for lab too, because the parts of the spinal cord and the nerve plexuses. I'll try to get through that. So a nerve, right, is in the PNS. You have cranial nerves. You have 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and you have your 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Remember, there's 8 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal, and they're paired, all of them. Even the cranial nerves are paired. So they're cord-like, and they call them organs because they have multiple fibers within them. So most of them are myelinated, but there are non-myelinated axons, so they're different bundles of axons, basically. Right? So your spinal, remember, 12 pairs. I'm sorry, 31 pairs of spinal, 12 pairs of cranial. So again, we'll go through those. And they could be motor or sensory or both. Usually the spinal nerves have both. They always do. Cranial nerves you have to learn. Is it motor? Is it sensory? Is it both? Is it special sensory? Is it autonomic? And we went through that with the E group. Tomorrow we'll do it with F group. So a lot of memorization, but you learn that, you're good, right? I know this is the time you're going to have to work a lot. I know this is difficult, but that's what you're here for. So let's get to it. All right. Now this is kind of like coverings. Again, we did this with the muscles. Again, they will ask you this on the, and it's pretty simple. It's just boring. And it's kind of, but it goes along well with what you learned in muscle, except now it's connective tissue that covers parts of the nerves all the way down to the neurons. So let's start with the outermost. I think that's easiest. It's a covering of a nerve, not just a neuron, of a nerve, which is bundles of neurons, mostly axons in the PNS. So the epineurium, remember it was the myosin in the myosin in the muscle. Now it's epineurium, and that's a tough, fibrous connective tissue, dense connective tissue, and they surround the whole nerve, right? The perineurium is deeper, and that surrounds these bundles of axons called fascicles. So we're going to have a picture coming up. It's always helpful here. And the endoneurium is between the axons. It's not part of the axon, right? It encloses the axons and the myelinated, for the ones that were myelinated. Remember in the PNS, the myelin-producing cells that surrounds the axon is called Schwann. In the CNS, it's oligodendrocyte. That's really important. We learned that in nerve tissue lecture. So we're probably getting tested on that now. So this is a real anatomy. You can see the outermost is the epineurium. Here's a fascicle, which are bundles of neurons separated by, and the fascicles are separated by perineurium. And within the fascicles, like this one bundle here, outside the axon is surrounded by endoneurium. Remember, endo is always inner. Epi is always top. And peri means around. So that kind of makes sense like when we learn the muscle. Epimysium, the endomysium, and the perimysium. So this is good to look at. I probably won't ask a lot, maybe one question on the lab, but you have to know what they mean for lecture and the departmental final. So I'll try to give you a good heads up of what you need to know. And there's a lot. There's no question about it. There's a lot. So here's the cartoon of this. So you can see a little bit better sometimes. The epineurium covering the perineurium, which surrounds this fascicle, and the endoneurium, which surrounds the neuron, or the axon in this case. So it's not part of the neuron, just surrounding it. And of course, there's a lot of blood vessels within nerves. So here's the thing about nerves, like most nerves have both. Efferent, which is sensory, and afferent, which is motor, and somatic and autonomic parts of those. Depends on where it is. Like the, again, we didn't do the autonomic nervous system yet, but the sympathetic neurons, or nerves, I should say, go along the spinal cord from like T1 down to L2 or L3. The parasympathetic nerves mostly are the cranial nerves and sacral nerves. So the sympathetic nervous system have paraspinal or paravertebral nerves, and the parasympathetic is cranial sacral. So you have all of these, though, in your spinal nerves. You have afferent, efferent, somatic, and autonomic. So they're mixed nerves, just like the cranial nerves can be mixed, which have both sensory and motor fibers within them. Remember, these aren't neurons. These are bundles of neurons. You saw the whole thing. So traveling to and from the CNS. So to the CNS is afferent, sensory. From the CNS is efferent, motor. And that's really what you need to know. And again, you did well. If you take this test, you'll do well. Motor versus sensory. Old stuff, right? Again, just repeating. So there's very few pure sensory, except for cranial nerves. There's pure sensory or pure motor. So most of them are mixed, right? So you have somatic versus visceral. That's all we were saying here. Somatic, and again, remember the effector of the efferent one is the muscle. Sensory goes from the receptor to the brain. And visceral, same thing, afferent, sensory to the brain, and visceral from the motor, from the brain to your organs, especially glands, right? Or again, a lot of that's autonomic to organs, not somatic, obviously. That's autonomic. So even a better word is like saying autonomic nervous system here versus the somatic nervous system up top, right? You're going through this. This is important. This I might have mentioned this before, though. Ganglia or cell bodies, remember, unmyelinated. They're not myelinated, so it's gray matter. So it's a gray, right? That's gray matter. And that's ganglia is gray matter or cell bodies within the PNS, peripheral. So outside the spinal cord, outside the brain. And you'll see there's something called the dorsal root ganglion tomorrow in lab if you didn't see it last week. And that's something that always comes up on a practical. So we kind of talked about that. And we'll see it in the spinal cord too. It's not in the spinal cord, of course, but it brings in sensory. So dorsal, remember this, I probably mentioned this, but dorsal root is about sensory, somatic sensory coming into the spinal cord, in the back of the spinal cord. Ventral is more motor. So again, ganglia is cell bodies in the PNS. Sometimes there's autonomic ganglia, of course. When you learn chapter 14, the autonomic nervous system, you'll see that there's ganglia for both parasympathetic and sympathetic outside the CNS. It's in the peripheral. And there's a difference between those two. So again, that's more autonomic nervous system, which hopefully we'll get to that when we do the rest of the semester, whenever in two more lectures, I guess. The cranial nerves, we're going to talk about these in lab as well, and we did talk about lab with the group E. So there's 12 pairs, and of course the first thing you need to do is memorize the names, and then be able to, in lab, you have to point them out on a model or a picture, right? And here's a mnemonic. I'm not even going to read this, so you could have fun with that. It just confuses me more. And look, you have to write them in Roman numerals. Yeah. Rostral means top, caudal means bottom or tail. So cranial nerve 1 is on top by the frontal lobe. Cranial nerve 2 is more below the diencephalon. And the rest of the cranial nerves, like cranial nerve 3 through 12, are basically off the brainstem, either the midbrain, pons, or medulla oblongata. So I want to go through this relatively quick because we're going to do this in lab, and I'll ask you some physiology in the lecture, and you'll get some questions on the departmental final exam. But I think once you learn them in lab, you'll be good, right? So this is just an example of picture what you might see on the practical, pretty close to, because it's Pearson. So some key parts, again, are the olfactory bulbs, cranial nerve 1, right? Cranial nerve 1. Then you have the olfactory tracts. This is the key spot here too. This is your optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, and both 1 and 2 are special sensory. And optic, of course, is for vision. These cross over and they form a cross, and they call this area the optic chiasm or optic chiasm, or chiasma, sorry. And then behind the optic chiasm is your optic tract. So know the difference between the optic nerve, which is in front of the chiasm, and the optic tract, which is behind, because the tract brings that information from that nerve to the visual cortex, which is in the occipital lobe. So get your bearings, make sure you know this is the frontal lobe. Here's the longitudinal fissure. And down here is your cerebellum, because you're looking at an inferior view of the brain. These are temporal lobes here, actually. All right. And this is the pituitary gland here, and the infundibulum is the stalk that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, anterior and posterior, which you know something about. So those two are nowhere near the brainstem, cranial nerve 1 and 2. Cranial nerve 3 is the first one you see below them, right here, right above the pons. Cranial nerve 3 is oculomotor. And you'll learn that it's motor, but it's also autonomic because it helps with pupil dilation and constriction. Cranial nerve 4 is really boring and small because it only innervates one extraocular eye muscle, and that's cranial nerve 4, trochlear nerve. Cranial 5 is a good one to learn because I'll probably ask you that. It's got 3 branches. It only shows you 2, but it's got 3 branches. It's one right in the middle of the pons. So cranial nerve 5 is trigeminal, so it's got 3 branches. It's got an ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular branch. And it's motor and sensory, so it's both. I think this is the first one from 1 to 5 that's both motor and sensory, so if that helps you. Cranial nerve 6, really boring. Again, just motor, like the trochlear nerve. Cranial nerve 4 and 6 are purely motor to extraocular muscle, just one, each of them. And that's right here, stuck between the medulla oblongata and the pons. Cranial nerve 7 is, now we get tough. These are where they get tough, right at the top of the medulla oblongata with cranial nerve 7, right? And you got to really find that. Coloring books would really be helpful here. Cranial nerve 8 is a little thicker because it's 2 branches, vestibular branch and cochlear for balance and hearing. So this is special sensory. Facial nerve is both motor and sensory and autonomic, and it's special sense. And vestibular cochlear is special sense for hearing, and like I told you, the special senses. So you know one's balance, one's hearing. So cranial nerve 7 and 8 are kind of bunched in together there, right? You can see them there, and there's 2 branches. Again, you can't see that, but you can see this is cranial nerve 8 here. Very difficult, cranial nerve 8. Cranial nerve 9 now starts to come off. Everything below 7 is basically off of the medulla oblongata. So cranial nerve 9 is glossopharyngeal. It's motor to the tongue. Glosso means tongue. And it's also special sense for the posterior third of your tongue for taste, gustation. Pharyngeal is your throat, so it's also involved in swallowing, motor, and it's also autonomic. This is the one I like to ask, the thick one right here called the vagus nerve, and this is very parasympathetic. It's motor and sensory, it's both. Cranial nerve 10. I would star that one, make sure you know that, because it should show up somewhere, and I'll talk about it on the exam too, lecture. And cranial nerve 11 is the accessory nerve. You can see it's kind of like goes down towards the spinal cord. Because technically it used to be called the spinal accessory, where it's almost like a spinal nerve. And here's where the spinal cord starts. Like right here is where your foramen magnum would be. So I'm glad we're doing this tonight, because then it'll help you tomorrow for F troop anyway. The E group didn't have the luxury of seeing this earlier. And then up here is where they throw the hypoglossal nerve, which is purely motor to the tongue. Cranial nerve 12. So do the best you can to memorize the names, the location, and motor, sensory, or both, motor and sensory. That's where you start. So there's tons of tables and mnemonics that you could use if that's helpful to you. So you can go through that. And here's the motor, yes or no. Sensory, yes or no, or special. It gives you the special smell, vision, taste, hearing, balance, and lays it out for you, right? And there's no sympathetic function of the cranial nerves. So basically it's all parasympathetic. So this is the autonomic, like the ANS, right? So you know if it's autonomic. So the facial nerve is autonomic because it involves glands, your salivary glands, and your lacrimal glands for tears. That's autonomic. Your oculomotor has autonomic, parasympathetic for constriction of your pupil in response to light. Yeah. Glossopharyngeal is autonomic because it's sensory. And again, you don't know what baroreceptors are in the blood, but it's special sense not special sense, it's a visceral autonomic sense for blood pressure coming into the brain. Vagus nerve is very autonomic. So yes, this is the one. So know those and know those different situations there. So this just runs you through all the different where it is and what it's for, and just repetitive. Olfactory for special sense for smell. It shows you the cribriform plate in the olfactory bulb. Remember the nasal meatus, I'm sorry, the concha, nasal concha, and this is the nasal meatus. I don't know if you remember that, if we even did that. That was actually in respiratory, you do that. You don't do respiratory. But you know the nasal cavity, you've seen the mid-sagittal part. Optic nerve is all about special sense vision. It has to do with the cells, the receptors, I'm sorry, from the retina, which are rods and cones. And remember the optic nerve, the optic chiasm, and then the optic tract is behind, going towards the visual cortex of the occipital lobe. And there's a picture of it. Ocular motor, again, where it is. And it's about constricting parasympathetic. So that's purely motor, but it's also autonomic. It shows it there. And you'll learn the eye tomorrow. You'll learn the parts of the eye that you need to know. It's a very short list. I think we decided there's like 11 things from each hearing and eye and the dissection model. Trochlear nerve, very, very boring. Again, it contracts one muscle, and that's the superior oblique muscle of the eye. It's about eye movements. So just that one muscle, though, trochlear nerve, purely motor to contract the muscle, right? And there it is. It shows it going to that superior oblique muscle. Trigeminal is more interesting. So now we're getting into both motor and sensory. So motor supply for chewing. Mastication means chewing. So remember the masseter muscle, which you have to know. And that's for chewing. That's sensory, especially around the eyes and around the face, right? You don't have to know the foramens. That's a little much. That's a little much. Yeah. And there's 3 branches, though, too. So the facial nerve is about facial muscles of facial expression, which you'll see cranial nerve 7. But the trigeminal nerve is about muscles of mastication, chewing. So it gives you all the little things you need to know. And just review. You just have to know the basics, right? What I'm telling you. Here's the sensory distribution of the trigeminal nerve. Still looking at the trigeminal. Now the abducens, again, is only one muscle of extraocular muscle, and that's the lateral rectus muscle. Innervating means the nerve that gives the power to a muscle or a gland or the heart. Innervating, it's a nerve giving power. So the lateral rectus muscle is innervated by the abducens nerve. And that's very reflexive, right? And voluntarily controlled. But it has to be a good coordination between all these. There's 6 muscles, and they have to be coordinated perfectly when you're looking to your right, looking to your left, up and down, and obliquely. Trochlear nerve, here it is, going to the one muscle. Boring. Facial nerve, now it gets exciting again. And again, you can see what hole it comes through from their nuclei in the brain and out to the periphery. But cranial nerves themselves are peripheral. Yeah, so it's got special sensory, taste, gustation, anterior 2/3 of the tongue, and motor for facial expression. Remember the orbicularis oculi and the risorius and the buccinator that make you drink a milkshake at Chick-fil-A or smile, right, or grimace, whatever those muscles are, and you learn that. And it's also autonomic because it feeds or innervates the salivary glands. Yeah, and also the lacrimal glands too, as well. Okay, more about the facial nerve here and where it is. Again, just the basics. Just the basics. Facial nerve distribution, again, just know motor It's motor, it's sensory, it's autonomic, and what it does. And that's cranial nerve 7. Vestibulocochlear, again, this is important. You'll see it on the model for the special sense hearing and the ear, really, learning the ear, which involves both. Vestibular is balance, equilibrium, and cochlear is hearing. So the cochlea is the organ of, not the organ of hearing, but it houses the organ of hearing. So in the inner ear. So vestibulocochlear is special sense, so it's sensory, right? Mostly sensory. They say there's some motor, but it's really special sensory only. Is a good, and this is what you have to know. Like, again, we're not going to do this now, we'll do it in the lab, but these are the parts you need to know. Not so much, you know these parts, but you should see that there's 2 branches. Vestibular comes here to the semicircular canal, and the cochlear comes to the cochlea. This is the cochlea, this is the semicircular canal. So the cochlea is for hearing, and the semicircular canals are for balance. So you have to know the outer ear, or the external ear, the middle ear, and then the inner ear. And the inner ear is embedded deep in the petrous portion of the temporal bone. Glossopharyngeal, again, it's special sensory and it's motor, because this is the taste sensation of the posterior third of the tongue. And it's tongue, glosso for movement, also motor, and pharyngeal is swallowing from your throat. So it's also sensory, of course, taste buds, like we said. And chemoreceptors, that's really what I was trying to talk about before with, again, that's a chemoreceptor that sends information to the sympathetic part of the nervous system and the medulla oblongata. And this shows it. It's also a salivary gland that it stimulates as well. This is the one we should know the best, the vagus nerve, right? And it's called vagus because it's a vagrant, because it extends way beyond the head and neck. It goes down to the pelvis and everything in between. So they call it the vagus nerve. It's a vagrant. This is cranial nerve 10, which is motor and sensory and autonomic. Right. So again, there'll be a huge picture coming up that shows all the places this thing goes. So it's mostly motor and it's parasympathetic. Remember, the cranial nerves are parasympathetic when you talk about autonomic. They're all parasympathetic. All the ones that are autonomic, and there's 4. There's 4 parasympathetic cranial nerves, and I'll tell you that. Let me tell you now. There's 4. The 4 autonomic, which are parasympathetic cranial nerves, are your oculomotor nerves, cranial nerve 3, your facial nerve, which is cranial nerve 7, your glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve 9, and your vagus nerve, of course, which is cranial nerve 10, which we're here. So those are the autonomic cranial nerves. The accessory is very boring. Accessory nerve is purely motor and only to 2 muscles. So the 2 muscles are trapezius and the SCM, sternocleidomastoid, which I'm sure you're going to spell that out perfectly when you do this test. But you could abbreviate on the lab practical 3 by just putting SCM. All good. I'm happy. I don't care. So the accessory nerve, that's all it really does. And of course, you have to be able to identify it. Hypoglossal nerve, again, glossus means tongue. And of course, they exit the hypoglossal canal, which is adjacent to the foramen magnum. So this is about swallowing and speech, of course. So moving the food around, and motor speech, which has to do with Broca's area, right? In the frontal cerebral cortex, cerebrum. And it shows you that there. So back to this. Okay. Back to this, just to help you know. And here's some more motor, sensory, or both mnemonics. Whatever helps you, Emily. Whatever you need to do, make up your own. If it's a good one, let me know about it. I'll use it. But I suck at mnemonics, so I have to rely on my own. Spinal nerves, and really helpful for your lab practical as well, and your departmental final. So this is all good. So 31 pairs total, and remember you have 8 pairs of cervical. Remember, there's only 7 cervical vertebrae counted down from the top, rostral to caudal, as they say, top to bottom. And there's 8 pairs, 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and only one coccygeal. So they're paired. And they go along different pathways to different muscles, different sensory areas of skin. And they're going to find out are called dermatomes or sensory. Again, here's the cervical vertebrae, 7. And in between, starting between C1 and C2, starts the first pair. Or above C1. And goes downward. So you'll see a picture in a little while. And so this C7 vertebrae is the nerve that leaves above it or below it, 7 and 8. So this is important just to know this anatomy for lab, especially because you have to know the brachial plexus, the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus. Cervical plexus is basically C1 to C4, or sometimes C5. Brachial plexus is C5, T1, just a plexus. And there's no thoracic plexus because there's no limbs. So you just basically have the intercostal nerves. And there's a thickness in the cervical spinal cord called the cervical enlargement because it has so much information coming in and out from the upper limbs. There's also the same reason with the legs. You have a lumbar enlargement down at the beginning of the lumbar. And then you have lumbar plexus, which is basically L1 to L4, sacral plexus, basically S1, but I like to say L5 to S5. And the spinal cord basically ends around L2, and then you have this branching horse's tail called the chorda equina. So basically your thoracic, or your thoracic, your vertebra or your vertebral column outgrows your spinal cord. Your spinal cord stops developing after a very young age. So there you have. So again, lumbar nerves, L1 through 5, sacral S1 through S5, and 1 coccygeal. But the plexuses are groups. So there's 4 plexuses that you need to know. We'll revisit that. This is important. The ventral front root of the spinal nerve is where the motor leaves, right, out, efferent. Dorsal roots of the spinal nerve is where sensory incoming, afferent. And you'll see what the rootlets are attaching to the spinal cord. And you probably have to know that for lab as well. So the dorsal and ventral roots, the dorsal root ganglion, which you'll see, and that's the group of cell bodies in the PNS just outside the ventral root, just part of the ventral root. I'm sorry, the dorsal root. So you can see that here. This is the, let's say, any vertebrae, the bodies, somas, and this is the intervertebral discs. Here's your spinal cord cross-section. Again, we did this in lab, but some of you didn't get this yet. So this little H, like that Under Armour H that crosses over, is your gray matter. And then the white matter is kind of surrounds it. So there's dorsal white, lateral white, and anterior white. And they have special names. Same thing with the gray matter. You have dorsal gray horn, lateral gray horn, and ventral gray horn, also known as anterior. So here's your spinal nerve right here. It has different branches as it leaves the central part of the body. And the dorsal root ganglion is right here as part of the dorsal root. And these are the dorsal rootlets. This is the ventral root, which shows no ganglion. And here you have sympathetic ganglia that kind of travel along the spinal column. So this could be lumbar or thoracic. And they leave from the intervertebral foramina, which are lateral between the vertebrae. And the end of the, or really the bottom of the spinal nerves, at the bottom of the spinal cord is the horse's tail. That's what chorda equina means. And spinal nerves have a dorsal and ventral ramus and a meningeal branch. I'm not going to go that far in lab. Okay, and the rami communicantes. And this is all visual. Nuts and bolts, just showing you the branches. So this is a superior view. All right, We can look superior in this case, and you can see the vertebral body. Here's the spinal cord, ventral root, dorsal root ganglion, and the spinal nerve that has a ventral ramus and a dorsal ramus. So just innervating dorsal and innervating ventral from the same spinal nerve level. And they communicate here called the rami communicantes. And the sympathetic trunk is not part of the spinal nerve technically, but there are autonomic fibers within there. And this is thoracic, so you can see the intercostal nerves. This is not part of the plexuses. This just explains that the dorsal rami is going to the back body trunk. Ventral is the limbs. And the roots you saw, and the rami lie distal. Remember, both sensory and motor in these cases. So there's no plexus between T2 and T12 counting down. So we're going to talk about the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral plexuses, right? And there's several different spinal nerves within one plexus. So we'll see what that looks like eventually. So cervical plexus, C1 through C4, and of course, cutaneous nerves to the skin, which are sensory. And then you have innervation to the muscles coming from the cervical plexus. Now, these are neck muscles, not arm, because that would be brachial plexus. This is important, and I might have mentioned this before. The nerves, spinal nerves on both sides, C3 to C5, part of the cervical plexus, the C3, C5 specifically, make up what's called the phrenic nerve distally. The phrenic means diaphragm. So the diaphragm is innervated by the phrenic nerve, which is part of the cervical plexus. And the diaphragm is very important for breathing. The diaphragm contracts when you inhale, to make you inhale, actually, and relaxes when you exhale. So this is a really important situation here between phrenic nerve innervating the diaphragm, assisting with respiration. And even though it's a skeletal muscle, the diaphragm, it does have some autonomic function or autonomic innervation via the phrenic nerve from the medulla oblongata, actually. So that correlation between the medulla oblongata respiratory centers and the cervical nerves, the phrenic nerve, and the diaphragm itself, important for respiration. So this is a close-up. Again, you don't have to memorize all of this, but you have to know this, that the cervical plexus is basically C1 through C4. And if you said C5, it'd be okay. But it really, truly is C1 through C4. And exits on both sides. And you have different branches. And C3 to C5 is the phrenic nerve. Accessory nerve is just showing you that. It comes from the brainstem, though. The accessory nerve is cranial nerve 9. And you wouldn't have to point that out on this particular picture. But in lab, you have to know that this is the cervical plexus. And again, the cranial nerves in conjunction with this. So you have to know, first of all, this is the cervical plexus.
Excuse me, Professor.
Yes.
By any chance, do you know what page this is in the big book?
Lab book?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's in there.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's in there. I'm sure it's somewhere, but I don't see it there. But look in the departmental laboratory guide. There's a one page that has this. I don't know if it's a picture, though. You might have to go to your textbook.
All right.
So, but the PowerPoint should have it somewhere. If it doesn't, let me know. I'll put it in for you. Okay? So again, cervical plexus, and again, talking about the phrenic nerve. And for me, you really don't have to know each division, root, trunk, and cord, because that's too much. You have enough to worry about. So again, this is brachial plexus now. And basically that's C5 all the way to T1. That's what we should remember. Okay, so now we're talking about the limbs, because brachial means arms, right? So we're talking about the upper limb. So here's the brachial plexus broken down. Now here's some nerves you should remember. that are part of the brachial plexus. And they start at these roots, and then they have divisions, which go to cords, and they'll branch further to nerves. So like, for example, the axillary nerve innervates the deltoid muscle. The musculocutaneous nerve innervates the biceps brachii and the brachialis. The radial nerve innervates the triceps brachii. So see how that kind of forms those innervations. Median and ulnar have to do with those hard muscles, right, that we went over in lab, and we'll go over them again, hopefully in review. The muscles of the forearm, right? Remember the muscles of the forearm, the brachioradialis, the extensor carpi radialis, and flexor carpi ulnaris, all those different ones that have different movements. Know the actions and know the origins insertions. And that's another thing that you have to know for this exam. Lab exam, not a lecture. This is a nice little breakdown of the brachial plexus here. Shows you where the difference between the roots, the trunks, the divisions, cords, and then the terminal branches are those nerves that I told you about. Arms, right? Arms and hands, ultimately, with the ulnar and median and the radial nerve. So yeah, so this is here. So I would keep this in mind. Again, this could be on a lecture too, these three things. And median nerve also is, we talked about it in class a little bit about carpal tunnel syndrome. Usually this is the nerve that's blocked by the carpals and gives numbness in the hands, the wrist and the fingers, especially the first three fingers, the 1, 2, and 3. So axillary and deltoid, teres minor, which is a rotator cuff, and sensory too. And then musculocutaneous, the biceps brachii, the brachialis. And there is a muscle called the coracobrachialis. I'm not sure if it's on the list. Very thin muscle. I think it is. It's right medial between the brachialis and the biceps brachii. And musculocutaneous also has sensory. So all three of these are both motor and sensory, just like most of the nerves. So even not that far in those major divisions. The ulnar nerve, so that's ulnar side. So you're going to have the flexor carpi ulnaris. And in case you don't have to know the digitorum profundus, but all the muscles of the hand and finger flexion. Radial is extensor muscles. It's also the triceps brachii, the extensor muscles of the wrist, and the supinators, and also has sensory information. So this is showing the further breaking down, branching of the brachial plexus. C5 to T1 nerves. Real anatomy of the brachial plexus. Very tough to dissect this with all the extra tissue there. Always like these, your tables. So injuries of the brachial plexus, of course, are common because the bottom of your neck is so mobile, and shoulder injuries on top of it. So again, tackling in football, stretching, tension stretching of these cords of nerves in the brachial plexus causes numbness in the fingers, lack of mobility, maybe even paralysis and severe problems in the arms and fingers. Carpal tunnel syndrome, again, that has to do with the median nerve compression, which is a extension of the brachial plexus. Right, of course, slashing it or injury to the wrist. Ulnar nerve, think medial side, right? Ulnar side, pinky side. And again, a problem with this gives you that claw hand. And the funny bone, right? The funny bone is basically the medial epicondyle, between the medial epicondyle and the olecranon process. So when you kind of put pressure on that ulnar nerve, You get that tingling and buzzing down to your finger. So you could have sensory and motor issues if this injury to the ulnar nerve. Claw hand, ulnar. Like wrist drop is more radial nerve when you can't extend your wrist. Saturday night paralysis. You fall asleep with your arm draped over the back of a chair. Huh. That could happen at Chick-fil-A with a strawberry milkshake. So wrist drop, radial nerve. And there's wrist drop. So you can't extend wrist extensors. Okay, lumbar plexus. Now we're talking about the lower limb. And I always put these together. I like to talk about the lumbar and sacral plexus together because they kind of have some crossover. So there is some lower trunk innervation as well in the lumbar plexus. So this is L1 to L4. And the thigh, of course. And that's where the femoral nerve is. And that's for the quadriceps, the femoral nerve. So we learned the quadriceps. Now you know the innervation, motor innervation. And there's also sensory, pretty much along the same distribution. But basically, a femoral nerve is part of the lumbar plexus. So that's really the takeaway. Like if you say femoral nerve, what plexus does it belong to? And that's the lumbar plexus. Obturator, about the adductor muscles, the gracilis, the adductor magnus, and the adductor longus. So obturator is a lumbar plexus. And there it is. Pretty straightforward. Nuts and bolts wiring down to L5, really. So there could be some crossover between the lumbar and the sacral, which you'll see. And this shows the branching further down to the leg. Sacral plexus. And technically the sciatic nerve is sacral plexus, but it does have branches from lumbar as well. So this is like a meter long, this nerve, and it's innervation to the back of the leg and actually to the adductor magnus. That's one that has double innervation. And most of the muscles of the bottom, right? But they branch. Like below the knee, you have medial branch of the sciatic nerve called tibial nerve. And then lateral is common fibular, which makes sense because the fibula is lateral and the tibia is medial. So for exam-wise, I would say sacral plexus is, the sciatic nerve is part of the sacral plexus, but it does arise from a little bit higher. So sacral plexus, this is what you need to know, L4 to S2. And there it is close up with the cords, divisions, roots, and extension nerves. So sciatics really ultimately will become two nerves. It's so thick. The tibial, which is medial, and is below the knee, and the fibular, or common fibular, which is lateral. This is the back view because it does emanate from behind the os coxa. And you have muscles coming across here, hip rotators. And you can see where the branching happens right here of the sciatic nerve. Tibial goes straight down to the calf and will innervate the gastrocnemius and the soleus. And the common fibula will go lateral and innervate the peroneus longus or the fibularis longus. So, you should be pretty familiar with the muscles by now. Okay, here's the dissection. So the gluteus medius has been cut. It's still part of it is there, but it's been cut here. And this is that muscle right here that is called the piriformis. It's a hip rotator muscle. It's right on top of the sciatic nerve. So the sciatic nerve, again, is two branches melded together that are split down below the knee. The sciatic nerve. Okay, so here's some of the lumbar plexus, femoral, of course, the obturator. You don't have to know these, but it makes sense where they're going. All right, so no femoral and obturator. This is the sacral plexus. And again, it makes sense. These are the parts of the sciatic, know that one the best, but these you don't really have to know, but it makes sense. The gluteal, superior and inferior, and then cutaneous and prudental is between the legs, between the in the female between the vagina and the anal canal, and the male between the scrotum and the anal canal. It's prudental area, but innervated by the sacral plexus. So here's a really good table to learn these and remember them. Phrenic, axillary, musculocutaneous. This is really good. This is a really good one for you to see. So I'm recording that. So it's major spinal plexus nerves. Very good. So this is more about injuries. When you have compression of the nerve roots, like could be a herniated disc. Right? Gait means the way you walk. Right? It could affect your walking, how you walk, your limping, foot drop, things like that could come arise if there's a compression of the lumbar roots and the lumbar plexus. Sometimes it's a sensory problem like pain or numbness as well, or both. You could have motor here, or you could have sensory like this. Femoral nerve, of course, is by flexing the hip and extending the knee, especially extending the knee. So the femoral nerve innervates the quadriceps. The quadriceps extend the knee, and also there's hip flexion as well. So there's hip flexors, like the sartorius is like a weak hip flexor. So you should know the sartorius, like where it is, and name it on the exam. So damage to especially in the lumbar and cervical, the roots can be damaged by discs, intervertebral discs, especially the nucleus of the intervertebral discs, actually herniating into the nerve root and compressing them. Yeah. And if you have an obturated nerve, of course, that innervates the skin of the adductor area. So you'd have pain in the medial thigh. So that could happen kind of general, very vaguely, depends on where in the plexus it happens. A sciatica, I may have mentioned before, is just a symptom. So it could be pain. It could be numbness too, not just pain. Tingling, pins and needles, which is called paresthesias. But it has a cause. Like sciatica, again, is just a symptom of pain or paresthesia or a symptom down the back of the leg from the butt. So how does it happen? It could be a disc herniation or badly placed injections. So nurses, you got to be careful here if you're doing a intramuscular injection into a gluteus maximus, say, and you poke that needle straight in instead of downward and away from the nerve, you could zap the sciatic nerve, and that's going to hurt like lightning at first, and then it may hurt for a little while longer. So if you're giving intramuscular injections, you want to stay away from the sciatic nerve. So know where it is and know the bony landmarks around it, like the coccyx and the greater trochanter of the femur. Yeah, so transected means, it's cut in half. It's cut. The nerve is cut. And then you have no innervation. It's like cutting a wire that goes to your lamp. There's no energy. There's no innervation. And it becomes useless or possibly paralyzed. Of course, that would be flaccid paralysis. There would be no movement, be completely limp. If it was something like the sciatic nerve, you'd probably need a good pruning knife to cut that thing off, or shears. And of course, this leads to something like foot drop. You have your foot drops into plantar flexion because you have no dorsiflexion. So know the difference, of course, between plantar flexion, foot going down, dorsiflexion is the foot going up. So, of course, if you have an injury, it's going to take very long because nerves, peripheral nerves, not so bad, but any nerve or neuron, or nerve especially, is what we're talking about, it takes a long time to heal. It's a very slow process that sometimes never heals completely. So, and it depends on the damage, of course. It depends on the health of the person. And really, the Schwann cells are really the only thing, and satellite cells, which are the two glial cells in the PNS, could help heal or try to get at least a function back to the injured nerve. Yeah. So it depends on what nerve is affected. And so, of course, it's going to affect your gait. So gait is the way you walk. All right, like a horse has a certain amount of gait. So if you have foot drop, that's going to affect the way you walk. Or if you have a shuffling gait, like somebody who has Parkinson's, or in this case, an injury to the sciatic nerve, you'll have a different kind of walking that looks completely abnormal because the innervation is gone. I'm not going to talk much about intercostal nerves. Just know that they're part of the thoracic nerves. Now, thoracic is not a plexus. They're just straight up 1 to 12, mostly about intercostal nerves. So that's really the takeaway with the thoracic spinal nerves and the front and back. Really not that important. But always know motor and sensory. So dermatomes are interesting because these are the areas of the skin innervated by each particular nerve root. Right? The only one that doesn't participate is C1, the atlas. So that goes straight up, to the side and part of the sacral plexus, technically. So dermatomes, which hopefully there'll be a picture on the next page or the page ahead, that shows you where the distribution, and you don't have to memorize these, you just have to know what dermatomes are. And that's sensory areas that are innervated by one specific spinal nerve root or spinal nerve. So these are the dermatomes front and back. But it makes sense, like you can see that the nerve roots from the brachial plexus are down the arm, and cervical plexus is up and around the neck. All the thoracic front and back, color coded. Then you have your lumbar plexus, and then sacral plexus, and back here, sacral plexus. So all the different dermatomes. So if you have an injury, like say to the C6 nerve root of the brachial plexus, you could have weakness in a muscle like the palmaris longus, or you could have numbness in this dermatome distribution. So the dermatomes are about sensation, right? This is sensory only, this is not motor. But you could have both, because remember the cervical 6 nerve root, or any nerve root, has both motor and sensory. So if you have an injury like a herniated disc or an injured nerve root or compressed nerve root or cancer that compresses the nerve root, like a tumor, it could either be motor, sensory, or both problems, like numbness and paralysis based on that nerve root being affected. The joints. Okay, the joints have innervation. Like remember, the receptors are the kinesthetic receptors and the Golgi tendons in and around joints. So mostly the movable joints, like you learned in joints, the synovial joint. Hilton's law, any nerve serving a muscle that produces movement at a joint also innervates the joint and skin. So the muscle around the joint and the joint itself share the same innervation. And that's Hilton's law. I wonder if that's Paris Hilton, if you know who Paris Hilton is. So Hilton's law is just a simple statement that the muscle or the nerve that innervates the muscle around the joint and happens to be moving the joint is going to also innervate the joint, the skin, so the cutaneous or sensory. Okay, pause that for a minute. Somatic reflexes. Now, of course, somatic is going to have an effector of a skeletal muscle, right? Is the effector. And a reflex is something that happens without the use of the brain, really. You don't use the brain. The brain doesn't have to decide to make the muscle contract. And the ones that we'll talk about mostly are spinal cord reflexes. So the input does go into the CNS, into the spinal cord, but it doesn't need the brain to voluntarily contract that skeletal muscle. So I want to say automatic, but I don't want to confuse that with autonomic, because it is automatic. It's reflexive, and that's, again, happens without the use of the cerebral cortex, especially part of the cerebrum. So here's some things. Inborn reflexes mean no matter what, you're wired to have these. You don't have to learn these. And this is, again, about survival, about protection, from a stimulus that could be dangerous. right? And also more homeostatic things like just maintaining posture or visceral activity. So there's visceral reflexes that aren't just somatic. We want to talk about somatic reflexes. Right? And of course, this could be modified by learning, because things that are, even though they are reflexive as a child, they can be altered as you get older and you learn, right? And that's what happens here. So acquired reflexes come from doing a skill, like cerebellum things, like driving, right? So inborn are you're wired to have these. Learned, you have to develop that pathway. But even things like sometimes, like you don't, as a kid, you don't know what hot or cold is, perception of it. So you don't know, like hot can be painful. So sometimes you have to acquire that memory. And unfortunately, that's a bad way to learn it, right? When you have to feel something hot. So this is key. This is what you have to know. And this is what you have to commit to memory. And once you get this down, then it's a lot easier to map out these reflexes. So of course, just like any other nervous input, you need a receptor. So the receptors for reflexes are going to be pain receptors. They're going to be stretch receptor, like the muscle spindle. Another tension receptor, like the tendon organ, right? Or joint proprioceptors, which the tendon organ and the muscle spindle are proprioceptors. So the joint receptors can also be used in reflexive arcs. And then, of course, you need the incoming neuron, the afferent neuron, which is a sensory neuron. Remember, that's a unipolar neuron that goes way back to the beginning of the nervous system. So that's afferent coming into the spinal cord first. So it goes to the spinal cord first before it goes anywhere else. And then the sensory input into the spinal cord is going to be integrated. So the integration center is in the CNS, and it's usually in the lateral horn of the gray matter. So a reflex could either just have one synapse, and monosynaptic is the term for one synapse. Like the synapse could just be between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. So you'd have a nice loop without an interneuron. But when it's polysynaptic, you have an interneuron, or more than one interneuron. There's only one reflex that's monosynaptic, though, and that's the stretch reflex, or the knee-jerk reflex, or postural reflex, they call it sometimes. So everything else is polysynaptic. So when we do the reflex, you'll see there's only one monosynaptic. And then after integration, whether there's an interneuron or not, the next neuron that's affected is the motor neuron, which is efferent. So that comes out the ventral horn of the gray matter spinal cord to the effector. And the effector is the part that's going to do the work, right? So in a somatic reflex, it's going to be skeletal muscle. Visceral could be a cardiac muscle or smooth muscle or gland. But we're going to talk mostly about somatic reflexes. So the effector, most of the time, if not all the time, is going to be your skeletal muscle contraction, like the quadriceps and the knee jerk. Quadriceps is the extension of the knee. So it's either contracts, the effector, no matter what it is going to either contract to do work or secrete to get work done. So these are the 5 parts. The receptor, sensory neuron, afferent, integration center, if there is an interneuron, that's important. The motor neuron, efferent, coming out, and the effector, the organ or gland or muscle that's going to do the work. So we're going to talk again about somatic reflexes, which is activate skeletal muscle. So what you have to understand here, again, there's 2 things. Like when you tap somebody on the patella ligament, it's a stretch of the quadriceps at first. And then the outcome is extension of the quadriceps. So in the knee jerk, I'll just call it knee jerk for now. It's a stretch reflex. But I think everybody knows this one. The agonist muscle, the one that's going to be excited to contract, is the quadriceps. So if the quadriceps contract, to extend the knee, you're going to need an antagonist, like in Hamlet. And the antagonist to the quads and this knee-jerk reflex, somatic reflex, is the hamstrings. So the hamstrings have to relax and be inhibited, but the quadriceps are the agonists that have to be excited and contract. So that's an example of a somatic reflex, knee jerk. Autonomic reflex, of course, is like a receptor that's picking up low blood pressure will send a sympathetic stimulation to the smooth muscle in your blood vessels or the nodes of your heart or the adrenal gland or sweat glands. So that's more about autonomic, right? Parasympathetic, sympathetic. So somatic is about skeletal muscle. So we always memorize the effectors. For somatic, it's skeletal muscle is the effector, whether it's reflex or not, really. And the autonomic effectors, motor, is smooth cardiac muscle and gland. So this is all about, the output is motor, and we'll talk about the input, how we do this. So this is a great picture. I always like the way Pearson does this because it shows you a pain receptor here. And the stimulus is the tissue damage done by the nail. And this reaction of tissue damage with tissue release substance P or some other chemical is released that is sensed by the receptor. The receptor is attached, in this case, is pain. So there's a free nerve ending just below the epidermis. And the incoming afferent unipolar sensory neuron enters the dorsal horn of the gray matter. And in a spinal nerve, this is cell body, right, which is a ganglia. If there's a group of cell bodies in the PNS, it's a ganglia. So this is dorsal. This is the dorsal root ganglion. And the nerve that brings in this neuron is the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, wherever this is. Like if this is the skin of your fingers, this toe, it's different nerve roots. Perfect. So here's a synapse in the integration center is the lateral horn of the gray matter. And that's where your interneuron will be if it's part of that reflex. And then on the ventral horn of the gray matter, which is here, so this is the dorsal horn, the lateral horn, and the anterior horn, or ventral horn. Then you have another synapse. So this is polysynaptic because there's an interneuron involved. And the interneuron is almost always in the CNS, and the spinal cord especially, in reflex, in the lateral gray horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. So the red fiber is your efferent a motor neuron coming out the ventral horn to the ventral root of the spinal nerve. And then going to, like, say, if this is your finger that's touching this, or the nail is pressed into your finger, this would be, say, your biceps brachii that contracts your elbow to move your finger away from the pain. So the effector is the skeletal muscle. So this is a somatic reflex arc. So it involves all the parts, right? Your receptor, the sensory neuron, which is unipolar with its cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion, and entering the dorsal horn of the gray matter. You have your interneuron in the integration center, which is the lateral gray horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. Then you have another synapse, so that's one synapse. Then you have two synapses here. Your interneuron, or this could just be the sensory neuron synapsing with the motor neuron, then it'd be monosynaptic, but this is showing you a polysynaptic reflex arc. Because there's more than one synapse, and there's an interneuron. So then you have your motor neuron, which is exiting the ventral horn of the gray matter, efferent, go into the effector, which in this case is a skeletal muscle. So if this was your finger, it would be the biceps brachii. If it was your toe, this would be the biceps femoris, which is flexing your knee away from stepping on a nail. So these are the five main components of the reflex arc, somatic. And polysynaptic, this one is polysynaptic, but it could be monosynaptic if there's no interneuron. And the sensory nerve just synapses directly with the motor neuron. And this is the same side, so nothing crossed over in this arc. Like this area right here is called the gray commissure. This is the central canal. This basically is called the white commissure. You're going to see in lab that these are called funiculus. The white matter is called the posterior dorsal funiculus, the lateral funiculus, and the ventral or anterior funiculus on both sides, right? So this gray matter crossover is called the gray commissure. Central canal is in the middle. So what's happening here is that all the information is happening on one side, and one side arc is called, or same side, is called ipsilateral. So like the stretch reflex is an ipsilateral, and the flexor reflex is also, or withdrawal reflex is also ipsilateral. Then if it crosses over, and crossing over is called decussation to the other side, that's called contralateral. So it could either be ipsilateral, that's an I, or contralateral. So ipsilateral is the same side, contralateral goes to the opposite side. And that happens in one of the reflexes called the cross extensor reflex. So stick to the basic arcs. Like I know there's more about it. I know eventually you're going to find out that somebody hits you in the knee with a hammer by reaching your cerebral cortex, but that would only block the reflex if your cerebral cortex gets in the way. So you really need to just concentrate on the arc itself. So this is the definition. I kind of botched it up before because it's kind of confusing. But spinal reflex is an output, like a muscle, somatic muscle contraction, that does not involve the higher brain centers like the cerebral cortex, right? Of course, the brain finds out about it. That's what I just said. But it's not part of the arc. So it'll happen whether you had a brain or not, is basically the way to describe it. Yeah. And sometimes you use, not sometimes, we do it all the time. You want to check people's reflexes to see if the spinal nerve roots are intact, if there's any injury, inflammation, herniated disc, or other things that can actually interfere with the output or input of the spinal nerve roots or plexuses even. Yeah. So you can see it could be hyperreflexive, which is too much reflex, too jumpy. And that could be pathological, or there could be no reflex or zero. Like they grade reflexes on a scale of 0 to 4, right? Or and +2 is like normal 2. 2 is normal. So 1 would be hyporeflexive, and 3 would be hyperreflexive. 0 would be no reflex at all, and 4 would be extremely hyperreflexive, pathologically, most likely. I mean, some people have, I know you've heard this, some people have a little more acute reflexes than others, and that's true. But really, if you do it objectively, you could really find out something about the condition of those nerve roots by testing these somatic reflexes. So yeah, so we assess the stretch reflex and the flexor, the two basic ones. And there's some superficial reflexes that can be autonomic as well, which you'll see. So you need reflexes for posture, to coordinate your movements, right? So you have to check not check, but the stimulus could be the length, which is a stretch that's sensed by the muscle spindles. So muscle spindles are mechanical receptors, proprioreceptors, that sense the change in length. So you could say stretch, right? Stretch, basically. In the tendon, tension is tested within the tendon. There's these Golgi tendon organs, or just tendon organs, also known as, you might hear this term, Golgi tendon organs. Okay, so they they sense the change in tension. So basically, the reflex that involves this muscle spindle is going to protect from overstretching and tearing the sarcomeres. The tendon organs are going to protect against overloading a muscle to cause such a contraction, maximally contracted under weight, to actually injure the muscle. So both of these are protective, as well as for balance and appropriate reception, right? But they're also protective. I think that's really the deepest reason we have these reflexes. So these are the muscle spindles. These are pretty specialized receptors that are in the muscle bellies themselves. So they have skeletal muscle fibers called intrafusal, and again, we need a picture of this, intrafusal muscle fibers, and they're encapsulated, like I said at the beginning, right? Because it didn't really aver that at the beginning, but they are encapsulated. And then there's the central regions, they lack the myofilaments, and you'll see that. But really, the extrafusal are the regular effector muscle fibers. And you'll see that the spindle is the receptor, but the muscle fibers themselves are part of the effector. And again, we need a picture right here, right? Because you know the different regions of the muscle spindle and the two different fibers, intrafusal and extrafusal. So again, you don't have to know the annular spiral or the flower spray ends of this muscle spindle, but just definitely understand the intrafusal and extrafusal. And hopefully we'll see a picture soon, because that's really important. So the ends are innervated by gamma efferent fibers. That's the neuron, or the part of the neuron. So extrafusal fibers, contractile muscle fibers. Now these are the contractile fibers. And alpha efferent and alpha motor neurons. So alpha motor neurons are really what you need to know. That's coming back to the quadriceps, say, and the stretch reflex. Oh, thank God, a picture. So much easier to explain when you have a picture than in these words. So the whole muscle spindle is this encapsulated kind of apparatus, right? And you have this alpha efferent. Now this is coming back to the quadriceps to contract it. Now this is the receptor. That's what I was basically trying to get at, and it's very difficult to explain without a picture. So the gamma, of course, are going to the spindle right here, and the alpha are going to the muscle itself. And here is the sensory endings of the sensory neuron that's going to go, of course, into the spinal cord. So this is afferent, the blue, and this is efferent back to the muscle. Now, this is the tendon organ right here. It's a different receptor. So this is showing a different receptor. The one for tension is down in, say, whatever this is, the patellar ligament in this case, or we could say it's a tendon. We could say it's a tendon on the bottom of, say, the biceps brachii. It's easier, right? Because you don't have a ligament there. So this is, let's say, the biceps tendon going down towards the elbow, and that's a receptor for tension. Well, the muscle spindle is the receptor for stretch. Okay, and just note the two fibers going out, and then the fibers coming back to the muscle, specifically to the muscle belly, because the efferent motor neuron that comes back is not going to go back to the muscle spindle. It has to make the muscle contract. So the spindle is just a receptor. That's what people confuse a lot. So again, talking about, this is the key. This is the takeaway here. Muscle spindles can be stretched. And that is the stimulus, stretch, changing the length. And that causes a depolarization in the sensory fibers coming in. And that could go, and there's multiple muscle spindles. They show that big one muscle spindle, but there are multiple muscle spindles. So you have external stretch and internal stretch. So the gamma motor neurons stimulate the spindle ends to contract, the gamma. Crazy, right? And the alpha on the outer. So again, stretching will send impulses to the spinal cord, sensory neuron. This is just showing the two lengths of the muscle spindle. And when it's stretched, you will have depolarization and input from the receptor, which is the muscle spindle, which is attached to a sensory neuron. Okay, you don't have to worry too much about that. Again, this is contraction. And now let's get to the reflex, see what time it is so we can go through this, because this is really what you need to learn here. So the stretch reflex, and this is also known as in the knee, it's called the knee jerk reflex. So it's responding to stretch. Now, again, this is about posture, but it's also protective of overstretching. So ultimately, the stretch of the quadricep is going to cause contraction of the quadricep. And that sounds like craziness, but it's true. That's the way it works. So the input is to the muscle spindle that senses the stretch, and that's the receptor. And the muscle spindle, it's monosynaptic, so the sensory neuron is going to synapse directly with a motor neuron, so there's no interneuron. That's the big thing about it. Now, reciprocal inhibition or innervation, whatever you want to call it, but reciprocal inhibition means that if the quadricep is the agonist, and that's the main part of the reflex arc for knee jerk, but reciprocal means the antagonist, like the hamstrings, are going to be the antagonistic, and they have to relax. So when you tap that tendon, or I'm sorry, ligament, the patellar ligament, as the knee is bent, the first thing that happens to the quadricep is a stretch, not an extension. So it's really flexing a little bit. So that little bit of stretch will cause the input of the afferent information into the lateral horn of the spinal cord, gray matter, and then an output, which is the efferent motor neuron to the quadriceps to contract. So the muscle that stretches the quadriceps, so the quadriceps contracts, and the movement of quadriceps contraction is extension of the knee. But at the same time, you have to reciprocally inhibit the antagonist muscle, which is the hamstrings. And that has to relax, or else no way you can do both. You can't contract two completely different sides of a movement muscles. So one has to be the agonist, one has to be the antagonist. The agonist is the one that's doing the direct work of the reflex. The antagonist is the opposite. Okay, so this goes back to breaking this down. So stretch reflexes are monosynaptic. It's the only one. One synapse between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron in the lateral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. And all stretch reflexes are the same side. So the input comes on one side, the output is on the same side. Therefore, that's called ipsilateral. Yeah. So, of course, this proves that the wiring is correct. It's very nuts and bolts. Built in, inborn, not learned. This is something you're born with. Hardwired. Again, stretch reflex. Also known as the knee jerk reflex. So again, some of the reasons that you'd have hypoactive, like a 0 reflex, or which would be absent. Diabetes is always a neurological problem. It's a problem with your blood sugar, of course. Your glucose is very, very high in the blood. Basically destroys your neurons and affects your nervous system, especially peripherally. So that's going to cause a problem, a disease that affects the nervous system, like neurosyphilis, or, of course, if you have a coma, that's, due to your nervous system, you're going to have no reflexes. Okay. Some other things, hyperactive lesions to the upper motor neurons that start at the cortex, like if you have a brain tumor near the cortex of the cerebrum, especially the frontal lobe, it's going to have a problem with hyperactivity, too much reflex. Pretty deep. So here is stretch reflex. Notice for the direct loop. Now this part is the reciprocal inhibition. So in the direct loop, there's no interneuron. So it's monosynaptic and it's ipsilateral. So here's the muscle spindle, and this is stretched. When you hit the hammer on the patellar ligament, the first move is a stretch of the quadriceps. And that brings the information in the sensory neuron. And dorsal root ganglion is here, the cell body in the PNS, and then one synapse. Now, at the same time, you're going to get an interneuron for the reciprocal inhibition to the other side, like the hamstring. And that's going to cause a relaxation. So that's inhibition in the antagonist and excitation to the agonist in this case. And it's all happened on one side of the spinal cord. Came in one side, came out the same side. No contralateral, it's ipsilateral. Here's another good view of it. So really, and this is explaining it too, when you tap the ligament, right, below the kneecap and the tibia, it causes a stretch in the quadriceps. The muscle spindle is the receptor, of course, that's going to sense that. Then the afferent information comes in the sensory neuron. There's a dorsal root ganglion into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. And there's no interneuron between this agonist and the receptor. So the red is the agonist, monosynaptic, and of course ipsilateral. The inhibition, reciprocal inhibition, comes from here. This innervation, reciprocal, inhibiting action potential at the hamstrings or the antagonist. So really the true reflex arc, and the outcome, of course, is extension of the leg to contract the quadriceps to prevent overstretching. So the true arc is about the quadricep. The reciprocal inhibition is just what has to happen in order for that arc to be completed. Yeah. So of course you have to adjust the spindles and the proprioceptors. So they give you some balance, well, with reflexive balance. So the tendon reflex, now this is about tension. Tendon reflex is polysynaptic, but it's also ipsilateral. It's polysynaptic. So this helps prevent, of course, stretch, but it's much about tension. All right, so it's a reflexive and protective mechanism, right? Because in this case, you're going to want to relax the muscle. So the tendon reflex is different than the stretch reflex. Right? This is a different reflex, and it's a different receptor. So the ultimate output is going to be relaxation, and that's going to be the agonist is the muscle that's going to relax. In this case, the quadricep again, but it's inhibited this time. So the antagonist would have to contract to cause relaxation of the agonist. And of course, there is information sent to the cerebellum because it's about motor. So now the receptor is the tendon organ within the tendon. And it senses either major stretch or tension. I like to say tension more. Makes more sense. Then you still have the next part is the sensory neuron coming in with its dorsal root ganglion, dorsal horn of the spinal cord. But then now you have interneurons always, so it's always polysynaptic. The tendon reflex is polysynaptic, where the stretch reflex or knee jerk was monosynaptic. So you always have an interneuron on that direct loop. The agonist is still the quadriceps. And they're going to relax this time. So you need to relax the quadricep. So basically it's inhibiting. And this side, the hamstrings now have to contract to relax the quadriceps. So the agonist is still going to be the quadriceps, okay, on the tendon organ. So this is really preventing it stretch in this time. But with tension, it would be the opposite. Then you'd have relaxation of the quadriceps and contraction of the hamstrings. So again, it's a protective mechanism against stretch or tension. But know the arc. That's really the key. Know the arc. So I think I'm going to stop here because it's getting a little complicated. I think I want to go back over this next time. It won't take long, like all the time. There's always